Picture waking up one morning to find 40 head of cattle vanished from your spread without a trace. Not a single moo, not a busted fence wire. It was just like the dirt itself swallowed them up overnight. Now imagine the very first suspect that crosses your mind is an Apache camp living right over the next ridge. Folks you never bothered to actually get to know. That is exactly what hit Ethan Shaw in 1879 Texas. And what he found out didn't just alter his ranch's fate, but also everything he thought he knew about justice, honor, and what being a full-grown righteous man truly means. The Shaw spread stretched across the Brazos River Valley, smack in the heart of central Texas. It was a red, noble earth, where the grass grew tall enough to hide a young calf. The horizon cracked wide open, making a man stare for hours and still feel mighty small. Ethan Shaw had inherited those 3,200 acres from Barrett Shaw, his father, who got it from Gideon Shaw, the grandfather who rode into Texas back when it was still called an independent republic. 3 generations of honest sweat buried in the exact same soil. 3 generations of calloused hands and rock-solid frontier pride. Ethan was 42, looking older, not from age, but from pure burden. He was the kind of fellow who wore heavy responsibility right on his face. He had broad shoulders, a square jaw, and dark hair heavily dusted with silver at the temples. His brown eyes were what folks called dead serious, the kind that rarely softened for a smile without good reason. Ever since Eleanor Shaw, his lovely wife, passed from a fever 3 years back, Ethan locked himself in a stony silence that his ranch hands respected, and local neighbors just gossiped about at the Sunday markets. 12 steady hands worked the spread alongside a tough foreman named Corbin Slate, who had ridden beside Ethan since he was just 20 years old. And there was a herd of 430 cattle, which meant absolutely everything to him. The future, the family legacy. His whole reason to wake up before dawn broke. One April Monday morning, Corbin stepped into the main house, hat squeezed in his hands. He wore a grim face. Ethan knew well, the look of a man holding bad news, unsure how to spit it out. "We're missing 40 head in the north pasture, boss." Ethan set his coffee cup down real careful, as if a sudden jerk might shatter a lot more than just the porcelain. "What do you mean missing?" "Missing, vanished. The fence is whole. The main gate was locked from inside. No mud tracks, no blood, nothing. Gone like prairie ghosts." Ethan rode up to the north pasture that very morning, checking every single fence line. He scanned the dirt for signs, footprints, any mark explaining this wild theft. He only found dirt packed down by his own cattle's hooves. And in 2 spots, something that narrowed his stare. Moccasin tracks. Light nearly erased by the dust. Right then, he didn't need to think twice. The Apaches had lived in the northeast hills for years, stretching back at least 2 whole generations. They never gave him trouble, not directly anyway. But Ethan had certainly heard the campfire stories. Every single cattleman in central Texas had heard the stories. It was the Apaches. He said, his voice bone dry and final, definitely not asking a question. Corbin stared right down at the dusty ground. "I don't know, boss. I see no proof." "These tracks prove it. You and I know the clumsy certainty of a man preferring a wrong answer over no answer at all." Ethan Shaw mounted his horse again and headed straight toward those hills. The Apache camp sat about a steady 2-hour horseback ride from his ranch, tucked inside a natural draw between 2 ridges, blocking the harsh wind and hiding their campfires from a distance. Ethan rode out alone, which Corbin called madness. Ethan called it dignity. A man needing an escort to talk, he figured, doesn't deserve the results of the conversation. Reaching the camp's edge, 2 young warriors stepped out to greet him without a single flinch, Coda and Tarek. They didn't seem hostile, just standing there firm and watchful. Ethan raised an open hand, showing he wasn't looking to start a war, though the 6-shooter on his hip spoke a nervous language. The chief of this Apache band was named Chato. He was a man around 55, sporting long black hair with a tough face that looked carved right out of dark timber. He spoke English way better than Ethan expected. With a thick accent, sure, but his words were chosen with deliberate care. "Your cattle are not here. Chatto stated, before Ethan could even finish explaining why he rode out. "Pull up a chair, folks. I came to ask, not deal." "He ain't here. Look around." So Ethan looked. He spent near an hour sweeping the camp with his eyes. The Apache watched in polite silence, knowing damn well they had nothing to hide. Still, that unspoken accusation hung over the camp like a heavy millstone right round their necks. Even the youngsters stopped playing to stare. Women worked on like he was a ghost, while the braves tracked his every move without flinching. Then he spotted her. She sat outside a tent, stitching with fine thread and a bone needle. Couldn't have been more than 25 years old. Straight black hair cascaded to her waist. Her skin held the warm tone of the red desert earth, and when those eyes lifted to meet the rancher's glare, they were a brown so deep they looked like midnight. They didn't flinch away. She held Ethan's hard stare with a quiet calm that truly caught him completely off guard. There was no fear or challenge in her gaze, and that pure stillness rattled him worse than a gunshot. Old Chatto caught where the rancher was looking right away. "That's my daughter, Jacali," he said, sounding more like a warning than an introduction. Without thinking, Ethan pulled his hat off his head. "Miss?" Jacali said nothing, just lowered her eyes and kept right on stitching, with that same quiet patience. Ethan rode out without a single clue regarding his vanished herd of cattle, but the girl's face stuck with him. He got home, dead certain the Apache were hiding something. Maybe not Chatto himself, but surely a rogue brave slipping past the chief's control. But her dark eyes haunted him too. The very next week, 20 more cows vanished. Come Thursday afternoon, Ethan saddled up and rode back into those hills. He'd hunted for a sensible reason all week. Made Corbin Slate check every mile of fence line and posted 2 ranch hands to guard the north pasture at night. They didn't find a single thing. The livestock simply vanished, leaving the land as quiet as if those missing steers had never even existed. What dragged him back to the Apache wasn't fresh suspicion, but a question his foolish pride wouldn't let him ask before. Now down 60 head of cattle, and with bank debts starting to rob his sleep, desperation finally outweighed his arrogance. Chatto greeted the rancher with that exact same steadfast calm. His weathered face even showed a faint glimmer of respect, the kind reserved for a man admitting he was wrong. "You returned," the chief said. "I needed a better answer. The answer you carried was yours, never mine." Ethan just stood there, speechless. He couldn't find the words. Right then, Jacali stepped up, carrying a clay bowl full of fresh water. "Listen here. Nobody ordered her to do that. It was a gesture of pure free will." She set it down in silence. "Much obliged," he muttered. "You lost more stock." It wasn't a question. "How'd you know?" "You wouldn't have come back wearing that desperate expression." Ethan studied her a few seconds, way too long for it to be just plain curiosity. He cleared his throat. "You speak fine English." "My mother was a Santa Fe trader's daughter. Taught me when I was little. Taught myself the rest. Reading, writing, and figuring out exactly how men like you think before they even open their mouths." This parley felt different. There was no anger in her words, just an unsettling, deadly kind of precision. Jacali seemed to measure every single phrase before speaking, weighing them on some invisible scale Ethan didn't understand, but instinctively knew he had to respect. "How do men like me think?" he asked, genuinely curious. She sat down, never breaking eye contact. "You believe every hardship demands a culprit. That culprit needs a face, and the easiest face to point a finger at is the one who looks completely different." Ethan opened his mouth, then shut it, struggling for words. "That's a mighty harsh judgment there." "It ain't a judgment, it's an observation. You rode in with zero proof, convinced my people were stealing. I've seen this before. If I'm right, then prove it." Jacali stood up with a smooth calmness. "But if you want my thoughts, the true trouble lies inside your own ranch, and you simply refuse to face it dead on." Those words stopped Ethan dead, like the Texas dirt itself had grabbed hold of his boots. "What do you mean?" "My people have watched this valley for 2 generations. We see things that folks working with their heads bowed down never notice." She went dead quiet for a heartbeat, measuring just how far she could truly trust him. 3 weeks back, I spotted fresh horseshoe tracks following the winding river down south. They steered completely clear of the pastures, but drove heavy livestock. It happened before dawn, right while your night guards were sleeping. Ethan studied her closely for a long, hard minute. Why are you telling me this? Jacali stared out at the dusty horizon before answering. Because my father spent 20 years forging real peace between our Apache community and the local ranches in this valley. I refuse to let some cattle rustler tear all that down by blaming us. That was likely the rawest, most honest answer Ethan had heard in years. He pulled his hat back on, completely aware of the heavy weight behind the motion. Would you show me where you found those tracks? Jacali nodded after a brief, tense pause. Tomorrow at sunrise, down by the big willow leaning over the river. Come alone. That evening, Ethan rode back to the homestead, his mind spinning like a windmill. He wasn't just worrying about the missing livestock anymore. Now he was starting to question his people. Who had clear access to the north pasture? Who knew the guard rotations? Who could drive 60 head of cattle and fence them without raising a single eyebrow? As those dark questions settled in, Ethan Shaw felt a sudden, bitter chill. And you and I both know it didn't come from the Texas night air. The next morning, he rode to the willow. Jacali was already waiting there. She wore a simple, dark cotton blouse, a heavy wool shawl draped over her shoulders, and her hair tied back in tight braids. She didn't offer a good morning. She simply pointed at the dirt. The hoof prints remained pressed in the dirt. They were a very distinct type of horseshoe, featuring a tiny triangular stamp right on the heel. Ethan recognized that mark instantly. It was the exact pattern used by Emmett Crow, the blacksmith, in Comanche, a settlement 30 miles south. And Ethan only knew a single ranch hand who sent his horses down there to be shod. Old Corbin Slate. That name sank right into his mind like a heavy stone tossed down a bottomless well. Corbin Slate. A man who had ridden by his side since he was 20. Corbin, who knew every inch of Shaw Ranch. Corbin, the exact guy who suggested the night guard rotations for that north pasture. Corbin, a man who in over 2 solid decades never gave him a single reason to doubt his loyalty. But 20 years is also plenty of time to craft an opportunity, and more than enough patience to wait for the perfect moment. Ethan stood there staring at those tracks for a long while. Did you know who it was? He asked without turning. I suspected it, but it wasn't solid proof I could simply hand over to you. Why not? Because if I had ridden into your camp naming one of your trusted hands without you seeing this dirt yourself, what exactly would you have done? Ethan didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew the woman was dead right. For the next 3 days, Ethan Shaw did something he'd never done in his entire life. He played the fool and pretended he knew nothing. Pulling off that kind of act demanded a cruel, iron-willed discipline. Staring Corbin Slate in the eye over morning coffee, discussing the cattle herds like everything was perfectly fine. Asking for guard reports and taking his lies with a simple, quiet nod. He even forced a smile at supper when Corbin spun an old, tired joke that everyone around the bunkhouse already knew completely by heart. But underneath that calm surface, Ethan was quietly plotting his move. He dispatched a fiercely loyal ranch hand, an 18-year-old kid named Jay Rowan, the son of an old partner who rarely ever crossed paths with Corbin Slate. Sent him to ride the trail straight downriver to Comanche. He armed the boy with specific questions for Emmett Crow, plus enough silver to make sure the old blacksmith's answers were dead honest. Jay rode back into camp 2 days later. Crow had indeed shoed 6 horses this past month using that exact same triangular stamp. Every single one was brought by a fella paying cold cash, and offering no name but the blacksmith painted a crystal-clear picture of him. A man around 50 wearing a beat-up gray hat, sporting a nasty little scar right over his right eyebrow, riding a dark dun horse with a stark white splash on its muzzle. Corbin Slate was 51 years old. He wore a battered gray hat the whole outfit had been begging him to toss for years, and he carried a jagged scar above his right eyebrow, a souvenir from a nasty fall 15 years back. The part that gets us Ethan himself had rushed him to the doctor. Now that dark bay gelding with the white patch on his nose that was Corbin's personal saddle horse. Called him Menta. After Jazz Rowan walked out of that office, Ethan just sat there in the dark for near an hour. Wasn't anger boiling in him. It was something much deeper. Betrayal carries a heavy load when it comes from a man you truly cared about, even if he never dared say it out loud. 'Cause that is exactly what Corbin Slate was to him. Not just a hired hand. Not just a foreman. He was the man who stood right by his side when they buried Eleanor Shaw. The one who stayed up drinking bad coffee through tough calvings. The man who knew every single horse on that ranch by name, and the story behind every last one. 22 years. Ethan finally stepped out of that office and walked down to the barn where Corbin was patching an old cinch. "I need you riding out with me early tomorrow to the south pasture," he said. "Want to check the river fences?" "Sure thing, boss. What time?" "Before the sun comes up at 4. Corbin barely even blinked an eye. "I will be ready." That night, Ethan lay down knowing sleep wouldn't come. He just stared at the ceiling in the dark, the same paint Eleanor Shaw had picked many years ago. His wandering mind drifted somewhere else. Back to the willow tree by the river, to a woman sitting on a rock weighing her words like she held pure truth. Now listen here. Jacali had done something nobody else did for Ethan in 3 long years. She treated him like a man who could actually stomach a downright ugly truth. No pity. No tiptoeing around his feelings, just flat-out respect. The kind of respect you give a man when you reckon he can still carry the heavy burden of reality. And in a way old Ethan could not quite explain, but felt more personal than anything he had experienced since the day his Eleanor passed away. At 4 in the morning, the very next day, Ethan Shaw and Corbin Slate saddled up and rode out to the south pasture, sitting about 4 miles from the main house. Out there, the river carved a sharp bend, and the willows formed a thick, natural curtain hiding the muddy bank. Ethan pulled back on his reins. "Right here." Corbin pulled up alongside him. "What is it, boss?" "I want you to tell me." A short quiet fell, but it was enough to speak volumes. "I do not know what you mean." Horseshoes stamped with a triangle. "Emmett Crow. Menta and that pale scar above your eyebrow." Ethan slowly turned his head toward his foreman. Corbin stayed quiet for so long that the early morning bird calls ended up filling the empty air. Finally, he dropped his gaze. "I needed money." He did not offer an excuse, just a cold, hard fact. "You have drawn a wage for 22 years, been drowning in gambling debts for 8. I tried digging out, just could not. The fellas who loaned me that cash are not the patient kind." Ethan just watched the muddy river water flowing by in silence. "How much?" $80 interest every single month. I paid the principal twice over, but those fees never end." Ethan cleared his throat. "You figured rustling my herd was your only way out." Corbin breathed deep. "I figured you would never catch on. Thought you would just blame the Apache folks." Another heavy pause settled. "I never pointed a finger at a single soul." Corbin muttered softly. "That conclusion was entirely your own doing." And Ethan knew he was shooting straight. Nobody planted that seed in his mind. It sprouted right there, watered by old prejudices so deeply rooted, he never even knew he carried them. He ordered the man back to the ranch, telling him to stay put on the property. He didn't fetch Sheriff Carter bricks right away. He had unfinished business. That very same afternoon, he rode back out to the Apache camp. Old Chatto greeted him without a flinch, like he knew from the very start this reckoning was bound to come knocking. Now, you and I might guess Jacali told him everything. Or maybe that wise chief just understood the rhythm of the trail too well to ever act surprised. "It was my own men," Ethan stated flat out. Chatto just nodded slowly. "I always knew my people had no part in it, and I know you knew it too. I rode out here to apologize for accusing your folks." The elder studied him with eyes holding decades of quiet, weathered patience. "It sure is not common to hear an apology from a white rancher in this valley." Ethan dropped his gaze for a moment, then slowly looked back up. "That is exactly why it ought to happen a whole lot more." Right then, Jacali stepped up, balancing a woven basket of herbs on her arm. She stopped dead when she saw him. No smile, no shock. She just stood there with that steady stillness Ethan now recognized as her way of paying absolute attention. "Find what you needed?" she asked. "Yes, thanks to you." She shook her head softly. "Not thanks to me. You made the choice to ride back to the river. You just showed me where to look." We both know any fool can point out a trail, but mighty few ride it. Next Tuesday, Sheriff Carter Bricks finally arrested Corbin Slate. The Shaw Ranch kept 11 hens and a completely different kind of quiet. It wasn't that heavy, mistrustful quiet anymore, but a clean, honest breeze. The kind you get when a hard truth finally steps into the light and folks stop pretending. Now listen here. Ethan managed to wrangle back 63 head of cattle from a makeshift pen about 20 miles south, right where Corbin kept a dirty deal with Mercer Bale, a border trader who bought stolen livestock, no questions asked. The law clapped irons on Bale, too. Those other 37 head never showed up. They were already shipped off to a New Mexico slaughterhouse. A mighty steep loss. Sure, but a whole lot lighter than the dark uncertainty that haunted his days of ignorance. What happened next rolled in slow and quiet. Just like fresh prairie grass pushing up when the bruised earth finally gets some rest. One afternoon, Ethan rode back to the Apache camp a fourth time. No missing cattle, no bitter accusations, and no apologies left to hand out. He just wanted to go. Brought some good tobacco for Chatto, who took it with a slight nod that almost mirrored a genuine smile. Afterward, those two sat outside the tent talking a good long while about the river. They chewed over that brutal drought from 2 years back that drained the water, and discussed how the ancient trails had changed ever since his ranch expanded those north pasture fences. Jacali wandered into the middle of those talks without asking permission or announcing herself. She just took a seat close enough to be part of the whole conversation, without making a fuss about being there. Chatto got up to fetch more water, or maybe he just pretended to need some and left them alone. "You come around here far more often than anyone expects of a white rancher," Jacali remarked. "Maybe I am learning what folks should expect of me." She shot him a sideways glance. "Or maybe you are learning other things entirely." Ethan did not answer, but he did not look away either. And in a rugged man like Ethan Shaw, holding your gaze was a whole speech. In the following weeks came more visits. Some had a solid excuse. Ethan brought word about neighboring cattlemen planning to stretch their barbed wire. Fences that might choke off trails the Apache community had ridden for decades. Jacali translated for Chatto, helping him draft up a formal grievance letter for the county office. Other visits had no excuse at all, and, truth be told, those were the most honest ones. Once Jacali rode up to the ranch to fetch some medicine Ethan had promised for a feverish young Apache boy. She arrived mid-morning, marched straight into the supply pantry, and only stayed as long as needed. But walking out, she paused on the porch and stared across the valley with a deep stillness. "It is beautiful," she said, not with green envy, but pure recognition. "My great-grandmother Annika lived right here in this valley before any ranches ever arrived. She used to say the prairie grass here smelled different than the rest of Texas." "It still does," Ethan answered. "I catch it every time the wind blows from the east." Jacali turned her face toward him, wearing a look that was the closest thing to outright surprise that old Ethan had ever seen on her. "You actually pay attention to that?" "Barrett Shaw taught me," he said. "He believed a rancher who does not know his land's scent does not deserve it." Jacali kept perfectly quiet for a spell. "Your old man was wiser than most folks. In some things, yeah." He paused. "In others, he left deep holes I spent half my life trying to fill up the wrong way." That quiet little porch conversation stretched on way longer than either of them ever saw coming. And when Jacali finally rode out, Ethan just stared down that dirt trail until she faded clean away around the bend into the thick brush. He felt right then that horizon. The same vast sky he'd stared at alone for 3 years had suddenly changed size. Stick with me, because the moment that shifted everything struck one blazing June night. A mystery wildfire sparked up behind a neighboring spread, threatening to sweep right down into our pristine valley. Ethan rushed out with his cowhands. Chatto's Apache folks showed up too, without anyone sounding the alarm, never asking permission. They hauled buckets soaking wet blankets and carried a dead-on instinct for how the valley winds shifted during a blaze. They fought side by side for 6 hours. No wasted breath, no old frontier borders, just resilient people desperately trying to stop the flames. Now picture this. Once the danger finally passed and everybody slumped by the scorched fields reeking of heavy smoke, Ethan found himself right beside Jacali on an old fallen log. Both stared straight ahead for a long while. "Thank you," he rasped. "For the second time in 2 months, you have helped this ranch, owing it absolutely nothing." "It wasn't for the ranch." "Then who was it for?" Jacali took a quiet second before answering. "Gather round, friends." His eyes swept that dark frontier. This land belongs to every soul living on it. Ethan turned his weathered face. Jacali stared right back. They were two grown folks who'd spent far too many years hiding their true feelings deep down. That's exactly why they recognized that same guarded stillness in each other. Like some secret Western language, only weathered pioneers truly understand. Riding back to his side of the ridge that night, Ethan finally realized he'd stopped measuring his hard days by the head of cattle grazing in the pastures. He started counting time differently. By the days folks rode up into the hills or just sat visiting on the porch. By those quiet afternoons when that east wind carried sweet grass scents, and he'd ponder what Jacali said about Annika, about this wild territory, and everything belonging to folks with the sheer grit to stay put. One scorching July afternoon, Ethan Shaw did something he'd never done in 42 years of living. He actually asked for help finding the right words. He rode straight out to Abigail Frost's place, the old schoolmarm from the nearest frontier town. A 70-year-old woman who'd taught 3 generations of county youngsters to read. Ethan just stood freezing on her porch for 5 solid minutes before finding the courage to knock. "What can I do for you, Ethan Shaw?" she asked, never dropping her knitting, like she'd known he was out there pacing all along. "I need to say something real tough without saying it crooked." Abigail rested her yarn in her lap, giving him that look of a pioneer who's seen it all, but still finds grace in this world. "Come sit down. This might take a spell." 2 hours passed. Finally, Ethan walked out with a folded piece of paper tucked in his vest pocket. He read that paper 3 times on the dusty ride back, not to memorize the lines, but to feel their heavy truth before offering them to a good woman who absolutely deserved words with weight. That same week, he rode into their camp for the 5th time. But he arrived late that afternoon as the slow sun turned the canyon pure copper. Before finding Jacali, he asked to speak privately with Chatto. The wise Apache chief greeted the rancher right outside his main lodge. Those 2 proud men stood face to face while the warm evening wind drifted softly between them. "I'm asking for something I don't have an automatic right to," Ethan said. "Have you learned rights are earned?" Chatto replied. "That's more than most men ever understand. I learned it from your daughter. Now, stick with me here." The old chief stayed silent for a stretched-out minute. "Jacali is the finest soul my people have raised in this whole valley," Chatto said, his weathered voice mixing pride, deep sorrow, and love in that complex way only a father truly knows. "I've never handed her over to any man, and I won't start now." He paused. "But if she chooses to walk your trail, I won't block her path." Ethan nodded. "Then I just have to convince her." Chatto let a ghost of a smile show. "You've already convinced her, Cowboy. She just doesn't quite realize she knows it yet." Ethan tracked Jacali down by the rushing river beneath that same massive willow where everything finally started making sense months ago. She stood barefoot on the bank, her toes sinking deep into the cool, dark river mud, staring clear across the bend, like she was holding a silent conversation with the water itself. She heard his heavy boots approach, but didn't turn. "You come down here every time you've got something important to say," she mentioned, completely without judgment. "I've started noticing that little pattern of yours. It is a mighty fine spot for important talk. This is where truth first showed up between us. So it definitely makes sense. Ethan stopped just a few paces shy of her. He pulled off his Stetson hat, not out of habit, but with pure intention. Jacali. She turned around, and right there, with the slow river rolling past them, and that massive Texas sky catching fire in deep purples and bright gold, Ethan Shaw spoke those words he'd spent 2 long hours learning to say, and a whole lifetime learning to actually feel. I know I'm a man carrying far more mistakes than victories. I know I falsely accused before asking, and slammed doors before seeing what lay beyond. I also know that what you hold, your deep knowledge of this valley, your people's respect, that unique way you look at things and see their true nature, none of that needs me to survive. He took a deep breath. You don't need me, Jacali. He held a brief, heavy silence, but I want to be the man you choose to ride beside. Not just a neighbor, not some friendly ally, but as your husband. As your true partner on this rugged land and whatever lies beyond. The quiet pause that followed held the exact weight of a whole lifetime. If you give me that chance, I'll spend my remaining days learning to earn it, one by one. The river just kept rolling. The evening birds filled the valley air with their twilight songs, let me tell you. Jacali stared at him for a spell Ethan could not measure. In that very moment, his whole rugged system just flat out quit working right. Deep inside those dark, unflinching eyes, he saw something shift. It sure wasn't doubt. It was the calm thinking of a woman who weighed every life choice heavy, and she wasn't about to treat this monumental one any different. She took one slow step toward him. Leaving the riverbank, her bare feet sank deep into the tall prairie grass, until she stopped standing just shy of an arm's reach away. Did you speak with my father? She asked. I did. He said it's up to you. Jacali gave a slow nod. There is something you must understand before I answer you. She spoke with that calm, straight-shooting voice of hers. If I go with you, I will never stop being exactly who I am. I won't change my ways just to fit what the locals expect to see sitting on the front porch of some white Texas ranch. My people remain my people. My language stays my language. What I know about this untamed valley will be treated as true wisdom, never some local curiosity. I want nothing else, Ethan replied. I want exactly that. I want exactly you. Jacali stood quiet for another long breath. Then, for the absolute first time since Ethan Shaw crossed her trail, she truly smiled. Not that faint, polite shadow, not that small gesture hiding in her eyes. This was a full, slow grin, breaking just like the Texas sunrise hitting the Brazos riverbed. It transformed her face so completely that Ethan knew right then and there he would spend the rest of his natural-born days trying to earn it again. Then yes, she said. They hitched up that September in a double wedding ceremony unlike anything this frontier county had ever seen. Now you and I know folks gossiped plenty, but neither of them gave a single damn about the town chatter. Up high in the hill camp, Chato led the Apache union ritual, with tribal elders present. The whole valley went quiet, like the very earth was listening in. Down in town, Judge Aldrin Cross logged that frontier marriage in a dusty office with creaky wooden floorboards and a big window overlooking the western pastures. He signed that binding document using the exact same ink pen he kept for registering land deeds. Ethan found that mighty fitting. In a strange way, this was a deed too, not claiming property, but sealing a lifelong promise. Jacali walked into the main house of the Shaw Cattle Ranch one crisp October afternoon, carrying an old leather suitcase that belonged to Sella, plus a bundle of wild sage she hung from a kitchen rafter that very first day. She declared the homestead needed to smell alive, beyond just old saddles and strong coffee. Ethan never once argued about her hanging herbs again. She transformed that dusty room Ethan called an office, a place he mainly used for piling up junk papers, into a proper study lined with books. She spent mornings in there reading, and sometimes teaching written English to young Alani and Yara, 2 Apache girls coming by thrice a week. The ranch hands quickly accepted them as a completely natural part of the homestead's weekly rhythm. Ethan buckled down and started learning the Apache tongue seriously. Fluency would take decades, he knew, but he learned enough to sit beside Chief Chatto and discuss the frontier valley without any translators. The old chief met that honest effort with a quiet pride, showing it through longer, comfortable silences. For a man like him, that was the ultimate mark of respect and acceptance. Things weren't always smooth. A few local neighbors stopped riding up to the ranch for a while. One or two even muttered, "Garbage not worth repeating." Ethan shut those fools down with such a cold, hard brevity that nobody ever dared question where his loyalties lay. Sometimes a heavy, homesick longing for the hills would wash right over Jacali. She never hid it, knowing he could handle her honest truth without treating it like some busted fence that just had to be fixed. Every week she'd ride back to the Apache camp, sometimes staying 2 whole days. Ethan never once asked when she'd return. He knew she'd return when the time was right. And that was enough. One night he went looking for her. A decision on a new fence came up and he needed her insight. Reaching the settlement, he found her sitting peacefully by the fire beside Chatto, her head resting gently on her old father's weary shoulder. Both just sat in total silence, watching those flames dance. Ethan paused at the camp's edge, took one look from afar, and realized that sacred moment simply wasn't his. He turned without a sound and headed back to the ranch. That pressing decision about the new wire fence easily waited 2 more days. Jacali never even knew he had ridden up there that night. Now she only found out years later when an old Apache woman accidentally let it slip during a casual conversation. She stood quiet for a moment, then finally spoke, not aiming those words at anyone in particular. "You and I know the frontier." That was exactly the proof she needed about his character. The first spring after their wedding found Ethan mending fences by the north pasture, right where the whole wild tale started. That very same dirt where a dusty set of moccasin tracks led him into the absolute biggest blunder of his natural-born life. While he was wrestling a heavy timber post into place, he caught the rhythmic thud of hooves. It was Jacali. She pulled her mount up by the fence line, just watching him sweat in dead silence. Ethan kept swinging his heavy hammer against the iron for a few beats before finally glancing up. "Trouble?" he asked. She offered a faint smile. "None." "Then why ride out here today?" "Just wanted to see you." He let out a low chuckle. "See what exactly?" "Just you." She let the silence stretch out. "Sometimes I gotta watch you from afar to remember why I rode into your life." Ethan dropped his hammer, meeting her gaze. The pale March sun blazed behind her silhouette, while the eastern wind rolled through the prairie grass, carrying that familiar frontier scent they both knew by heart. He just waited. Jacali cast her eyes across the wide basin. That exact same valley where Annika lived long before barbed wire or cattle ranches ever existed. A land steeped in deeply inherited memories. The exact river that buried the tracks of a bitter lie until the fateful day it finally decided to wash the hard truth ashore. Finally, she spoke up. "Yeah, I made the right call." Ethan stepped to the fence line, leaning heavy on the weathered timber. He studied her closely for a long moment. "Every morning I wake up trying to become a man who deserves to hear those words again." Jacali simply tilted her head. In those bold, dark eyes that never backed down from a stare, that slow smile blossomed. Ethan reckoned it was the finest treasure the Brazos River Valley could ever offer a man. "And every day you get a little closer," she replied. So in 1879, Texas alongside the peaceful Brazos, with the tall grass swaying in the wind, a rugged ranch learned that real honor never depends on skin color or which side of the dusty ridge you are born on. A brand new frontier story began. Because true, steadfast love didn't just spark when Ethan found Jacali. It was born the day he swallowed his stubborn pride to finally hear the hard truth. And that's when they figured out solid respect always rides in before love. Only folks who learn to look with an open heart can build a frontier homestead meant to last a whole lifetime. So if this old Western tale struck your heart, pass it along to another soul who still believes the strongest love begins right where foolish pride finally ends.